The wind howls, but that voice upstairs, is it human? Welcome to Silent Casebook. I am your host, Sterling. Join the conversation. Tell me where in the world you're tuning in from. Your words always make this journey unforgettable. Let's uncover the truth. The town of Belremont was the sort of place where no one expected to be surprised. Each day began with the sound of the bakery bell at 6, the milk cart on the cobbled street at 7, and the faint whistle of the train passing through at 8. Windows opened the same way every morning. Curtains lifted. A few sleepy faces appeared, scanning the same quiet square they had known all their lives. It was early autumn, the air sharp and damp. A faint mist clung to the edges of the canal that ran behind the row of faded stone houses. At the very end of Rue des Tilleuls stood a narrow 3-story home belonging to the Carvals. Its attic window had always been closed, a dark rectangle above the street. But this morning it was open. Not just open, swinging slightly as though pushed by an unseen hand. Old Madame Rivière was the first to notice. She was sweeping her step, pausing now and then to press a hand to her lower back. She glanced up, frowned, and muttered to herself. The Carvals were private people. Their attic was full of trunks and old clothes, they had once said, nothing worth seeing. As Madame Rivière bent to scoop a pile of wet leaves, she thought she heard something. A murmur, so faint it might have been the wind slipping under the tiles. She straightened, eyes on the attic window. The curtain moved. By noon, the entire street was whispering. Monsieur Carval had gone to work as usual, taking the tram to the textile factory. His wife, Elise, was seen carrying her basket to the market just after 8. Their daughter, Claire, 17 and withdrawn, hadn't been spotted yet that day. Someone knocked on the Carval's door around midday, but no one answered. It was around this time that Inspector Lucien Maraud was called, not by the police station, but by his own neighbour, who had overheard the gossip and thought it odd enough for his attention. Maraud had been retired for 3 years. He lived quietly, feeding stray cats and reading old newspapers at the café in the square. But Belremont had no other detective, and old habits die slowly. He went without his coat, only a grey sweater over his shirt, and stood for a long time in the street with his hands in his pockets, staring up at the attic window. The curtain swayed again. It was a small movement, barely visible, but enough to make the little group of neighbours murmur. Maraud's face revealed nothing, but he noticed the shifting eyes of the people around him. No one was frightened. They were curious, excited, and faintly disappointed that nothing worse had happened yet. "Have you tried knocking again?" Maraud asked. Madame Rivière shook her head. "We knocked all morning." Nothing. A younger man, Monsieur Piquet, crossed his arms. "They're hiding something. That girl, she's always in her own world. You ask me, she's up there doing something strange." Maraud didn't answer. He simply crossed the street, climbed the 3 worn steps and knocked. The sound was dull against the wood. He waited, listening. Footsteps, perhaps. Or maybe just the creak of old beams. When the door finally opened, it was Claire Carval standing there. Her hair was unbrushed, her face pale. She blinked at the sight of Maraud and the neighbours gathered behind him, as though she'd just woken from a long sleep. "Yes," she said. Maraud tipped his head. "Forgive me, your attic window is open. People thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. Claire glanced over her shoulder, then back at him. "I was looking for something. I left it open." Her voice trembled on the last word, so slightly that only Maraud seemed to notice. He smiled faintly, a gesture meant to reassure rather than to believe. "Nothing wrong then?" "No, she said. Nothing. She started to close the door, but he placed a gentle hand on the frame. Mind if I step in for a moment? Claire hesitated. Her eyes flickered, not with fear, but something closer to shame. After a pause, she opened the door wider. The house smelled faintly of cold stone and boiled cabbage. A single coat hung on the rack. The living room was tidy but bare, the furniture old and polished by years of habit. "Your parents?" Maraud asked. "Market? Factory?" He nodded, letting the silence stretch. He had learned long ago that most people spoke more in silences than in words. Finally, Claire said, "There's nothing to see. I was just putting some things away." Maraud's eyes drifted toward the staircase. "Would you mind if I checked? Just to calm the neighbors." Her jaw tightened. A long second passed. Then she nodded. The stairs were steep, creaking under his careful weight. The air grew colder as he climbed, and the smell of dust thickened. When he reached the attic, he saw sunlight spilling through the open window. A few trunks stood against the wall, nothing else. No body, no blood, only a faint disturbance, a corner of an old quilt pulled to the floor, a small ceramic doll missing an arm, and footprints in the dust that looked recent. He crouched and touched the marks with 2 fingers. Claire stood behind him, arms folded tightly against herself. "I told you," she said. Maraud nodded. He didn't argue. He closed the window, then turned back toward the stairs. Outside, the neighbors were still waiting. He said only, "All quiet." And they dispersed, with that mixture of relief and disappointment familiar to every small town. Maraud didn't stay to talk. He walked back to his little house by the canal, thinking about the tremor in Claire's voice and the shame in her eyes. That night, lying in his narrow bed, he thought he heard the wind again. Or perhaps a whisper. It came from somewhere distant, high and hollow, like a voice carried down from an attic. The following morning, Inspector Lucien Maraud rose earlier than usual. The sky was pale, a thin grey stretching over Belremont, and the faint smell of damp earth drifted through the open window of his small kitchen. He stirred sugar into his coffee without tasting it, staring out at the slow ripple of the canal. He hadn't meant to think about the attic all night, yet the memory of Claire Carval's eyes lingered. It wasn't fear exactly. He had seen fear before, sudden, sharp, unavoidable. This had been quieter, like a weight pressing down that she was too tired to lift. By the time the bells of Saint-Clément struck 8, Maraud was walking toward the square. He told himself he was going for bread, as he did most mornings, but his route tilted slightly, and his steps slowed as he approached Rue des Tilleuls. The Carval's house looked unchanged. The attic window was closed now, the curtain still. A faint trail of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was home. Madame Rivière was once again sweeping her step. She noticed him immediately, leaning on her broom with a knowing look. "You saw her yesterday," she said. "The girl?" "Yes," Maraud replied simply. "She didn't look right to me," the old woman went on, her voice dropping as if the quiet street were full of ears. "Pale as linen, and that window, well, it's not normal. Something's happening in that house." He didn't answer. He only nodded politely and continued toward the bakery. The morning routine of Belremont was its own kind of theatre. The baker's shop door was propped open, letting out a ribbon of warm, yeasty air. 2 men smoked on the corner, speaking in the half-muttered rhythm of those who have worked the same factory shift for decades. A thin dog trailed behind a woman carrying her marketing basket, hopeful for crumbs. Maraud joined the short queue inside the bakery, listening without appearing to. people were talking about the Carvals. Not directly, no one ever accused anyone of anything in Belremont, but in soft, suggestive phrases. Strange to leave a window like that in this weather. Never see that girl anywhere, like she's hiding. You remember the brother, don't you? Left for Paris and never came back. Maraud kept his eyes on the bread loaves as the conversations floated around him. Words carried more weight in a small town than actions did. A whisper could last longer than a shout. When it was his turn, the baker's wife handed him a warm baguette and said in a lowered voice, "You went in, didn't you?" "Yesterday?" "I did." "And?" "Nothing unusual," he said. He left it at that because people often filled silences with their own stories, and in a place like this, stories were a kind of currency. Yet he spent the late morning walking along the canal. Ducks drifted lazily by the reeds, and the water mirrored the slow grey sky. This was how Maraud worked best, by walking, by allowing the town to reveal itself through its ordinary rhythms. Around noon he saw Monsieur Carval returning home, coat buttoned tightly, his steps brisk. The man barely glanced up, as if hoping not to meet anyone's eyes. Maraud lifted a hand in greeting anyway. "Good day, Monsieur Carval." The man hesitated, nodded quickly, and fumbled with his keys at the door. He looked tired, not from work, Maraud thought, but from carrying something he didn't want to speak of. Moments later, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor came from inside. Then silence. In the afternoon, Maraud settled at his usual corner table in Café Le May. He spread his newspaper but didn't read. The café smelled faintly of coffee grounds and the day's soup. A clock ticked softly above the counter. From here he could see the small world moving past the window. A postman stopped to tie his shoe. A boy rode past on a bicycle, his scarf trailing. Across the street, Claire Carval appeared at last, stepping out of the butcher's shop with a parcel of wrapped meat. She moved quickly, head down, as though she feared the eyes of the square. Her posture was a story in itself, shoulders drawn in, arms close to her sides. Yet when an elderly man greeted her politely, she forced a small smile and nodded. A performance of normalcy. Maraud watched without judgment. In his years as a detective, he had learned that guilt rarely shouted. It sat in the body, heavy and quiet, and you saw it in the way people avoided doors, windows, or other people's eyes. That evening, he returned home as the canal turned silver with the fading light. The day had passed without incident, but the undercurrent of unease remained. After a simple dinner of bread, cheese, and pickled vegetables, he sat by the small lamp in his living room. Outside, the street was nearly silent, the kind of silence that felt like waiting. Then faintly, he heard it again. Not the wind exactly, but a soft, indistinct sound, like a voice pressed against distance. He leaned back in his chair, listening, letting the night speak for itself. But the next morning, he would find himself walking the same path again, past the canal and the square, toward Rue des Tilleuls. He told himself he wasn't investigating, only observing, but he knew that whatever had begun in the Carval house, however small, would not stay contained for long. And in Belremont, secrets never truly stayed in their attics. The air in Belremont carried a faint trace of coal smoke the next morning, mingling with the wet chill from the canal. Inspector Lucien Maraud left his home with no clear intention of calling on the Carvals, yet his steps took him toward Rue des Tilleuls all the same. He had told himself the previous night that he would let the matter settle. But something in the house's silence seemed to pull him back, like a half-remembered thought. The street was nearly empty. A milk cart rattled past, its driver nodding briefly, and the soft cooing of pigeons echoed between the roofs. The Carvel house stood as it had for decades, plain stone walls, peeling shutters. But the small attic window caught his eye again. The curtain was slightly askew, as if moved by a hand that hesitated. A faint movement at the side gate drew his attention. Claire Carvel emerged carrying a metal pail, her head bent low. She started at the sight of him, then tried to compose herself with a thin smile. "Inspector," she said softly, almost as if the word itself might be overheard. "Good morning, mademoiselle," he replied, his voice casual. "Chilly today?" She nodded, gripping the pail too tightly. Water sloshed over the rim, dampening the cuff of her coat. She glanced toward the street, then toward the house, as if caught between two places she didn't belong in. "You're fetching water?" Maraud asked, though the question didn't matter. "Yes, the pump, in the yard." Her words seemed to stumble out, and she looked down again. For a moment, he considered stepping closer, but he stayed where he was. Some conversations, he knew, only opened if you gave them space. "I hope your parents are well," he said instead. She hesitated before answering. "Papa is, as he is. Maman—" She stopped herself, then shook her head slightly. "She keeps to herself." There it was, a small crack in the wall, a simple sentence, but the weight behind it lingered. Maraud gave a small nod and tipped his hat before continuing his walk, leaving her to return to the shadows of the yard. Outside the cafe was warm, the windows fogged from the stove inside. Maraud settled into his corner seat, the same one he had occupied for years, and let the rhythm of the room surround him. The clink of cups, the soft scrape of chairs, the quiet shuffling of newspapers, Belremont at its most alive. Madame Lemay, the cafe's owner, approached with his coffee. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. "They say Madame Carval hasn't been to Mass in 2 Sundays, she murmured, as if speaking too loud might summon bad luck. Not since people started whispering about that attic." Maraud stirred his coffee slowly, letting the spoon clink once against the rim. "Perhaps she isn't feeling well," he said. "Perhaps," Madame Lemay said, unconvinced. She lingered a moment longer, then drifted away to another table. From his corner, Maraud watched the small performances of daily life. A clerk from the post office folded his newspaper carefully before leaving. A delivery boy ran in, cheeks flushed, to warm his hands by the stove. Across the square, he saw Monsieur Carval walk past with his collar turned high, not looking left or right. The house was pressing on its occupants, like a weight, Maraud thought. The family seemed to carry the attic with them wherever they went, as if its walls had followed them out into the street. By midday, the inspector found himself near the river, where the air smelled of wet wood and faint fish. Old Monsieur Blanchot was sitting on the low wall, smoking his pipe, his eyes fixed on the slow-moving water. "You've been watching that house," Blanchot said without looking at him. Moreau didn't answer immediately. He took a seat beside the old man and followed his gaze to the canal. "Everyone watches in their own way," he said finally. Blanchot grunted. "Houses keep their own secrets. That one's always been too quiet. Even before the boy left for Paris, I used to see him walking by the river at night. Never said hello. Some people don't know how to live among others." Maraud listened without interruption. Blanchot spoke like a man remembering things he hadn't planned to, and sometimes that loosened more truth than direct questions ever could. "You think something's happened?" Maraud asked mildly. Blanchot spat into the water and shrugged. "Something's always happening. Most of it just doesn't reach the surface." That evening, Maraud passed the Carval house again. A faint light glowed in the attic, though it was only late afternoon. Through the thin curtain, he could see a shape moving. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing a small room. He stayed across the street, his hands in his coat pockets, until the shape disappeared. He was about to leave when the front door opened. Madame Carval stepped out, her figure wrapped in a dark shawl. Her face was pale in the fading light, and for a moment she didn't seem to notice him. Then her eyes found his, and she froze. "Inspector," she said, her voice tight, almost formal. "Madame," he replied with a small nod. They stood in silence for several seconds. The street was empty except for them, and the faint smell of chimney smoke curled between the houses. "Is there a problem?" she asked at last. "No," Maraud said quietly. "I was simply passing by." Her gaze flicked toward the attic window, just for an instant, before she tightened her shawl and stepped back inside without another word. Later, at home, Maraud sat at his small table and poured himself a modest glass of wine. He did not write notes. He rarely did at this stage. He let the impressions settle instead, the awkwardness of Claire's grip on the pail, the way Madame Carval's eyes had betrayed a flicker of fear, the light in the attic at the wrong hour. It wasn't evidence, it was atmosphere. He thought of something his old mentor had told him long ago. People tell you what they are afraid of, but never in words. Watch their hands, their pauses. The truth leaks through there. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the town. He let the day close in silence. In the morning, he would go walking again. He would not knock, not yet. But the shadows inside that house were beginning to reach out into the street. And Maraud knew, with the kind of certainty that didn't need proof, that someone inside was carrying a private pain heavy enough to crack. The next morning broke grey and damp. Fog rolled off the canal and settled low over Belremont's rooftops, softening the sharp edges of the chimneys and spires. Inspector Lucien Maraud walked slowly through the square, his coat buttoned to the throat. He was not on official duty, at least not in a way that could be written in a ledger, but his quiet, measured steps carried the weight of a purpose he hadn't fully admitted to himself. The town was stirring. A butcher's boy cycled past, wobbling under the weight of a basket. A woman in a faded blue scarf swept her doorstep, pausing to wave half-heartedly at the inspector. He lifted his hand in return and kept walking toward the narrow street that led to the café. Inside, and the warmth greeted him first, along with the faint aroma of coffee and yesterday's bread. The windows were blurred with condensation, and the murmur of conversation filled the small space. Maraud took his usual table in the corner, the one that allowed him to watch without seeming to. Madame Lemay, as predictable as the morning fog, brought his coffee without asking. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. "Quieter than usual, I mean." Maraud stirred his coffee slowly, letting the spoon scrape the side once. "Some mornings ask for quiet." Her eyes followed his to the table near the stove, where Claire Carval sat alone, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped cup. She seemed smaller in the oversized chair, her shoulders curved inward, her hair unbrushed, in a way that spoke of restless sleep. "She's been coming in early all week," Madame Lemay whispered, leaning close. "Always before the sun's up. Drinks one cup, then leaves. Never speaks to anyone." Maraud nodded but said nothing. Gossip in Belremont didn't need his help. It was a self-sustaining fire. Still he watched Claire discreetly over the rim of his cup. Her gaze was fixed on the window, though there was nothing to see but the fog. When her hand moved, he noticed a faint tremor in her fingers. He approached her only after finishing his coffee, giving her time to leave if she wished. But she didn't. When he reached her table, she glanced up quickly as if caught in the act of something she wasn't doing. "May I sit?" Maigret asked. She nodded, hesitant, and he settled into the chair across from her. "You're up early," he said simply. "I couldn't sleep." The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile. Maigret didn't press. He let the silence stretch, the sounds of the cafe filling the gap, the scrape of a chair, the hiss of the coffee pot, a distant cart outside. "I keep hearing things," she said suddenly, her voice low. "At night, from the attic?" Maraud's face remained calm, almost indifferent. "What sort of things?" "Not footsteps, not exactly. It's like a whisper. Sometimes I think I hear someone breathing, but when I go up, there's nothing there." He let that settle before answering. "Houses make their own noises, especially old ones. Wood shifts, walls settle." "I know," she said, looking down at her cup. "But this feels different, like the house is talking to me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together quickly as if regretting it. "You've lived there your whole life," Maigret said softly. "Houses carry memories. Sometimes they remind us of things we'd rather forget." She looked at him sharply then, her eyes bright with something between fear and curiosity. "Do you think that's what it is? Memory?" "I think memory is louder than any ghost," he said. By the time he left the cafe, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the bare winter trees along the canal. He walked without hurry toward Rue des Tilleuls. The Carval house stood as it always had, but in the pale light, its stones seemed damp, almost bruised. He didn't go to the door. Instead, he leaned casually against the low wall across the street, pretending to study the shutters of the house opposite. A few minutes later, the front door opened, and Monsieur Carval stepped out, hat pulled low. His posture was stiff, his eyes scanning the street before landing on Maigret. "Inspector," he said, his voice clipped, "you seem to have taken a special interest in our home." "I take interest in the town," Maigret replied calmly. "Your home is part of it." The man's jaw tightened. "We've done nothing wrong." "I haven't suggested otherwise." For a long moment they stood in silence, only the faint trickle of water from the canal filling the air. Then Carval exhaled sharply. "My wife doesn't sleep," he said suddenly. "She hears things. Now my daughter too. It's making them sick." "Do you hear them?" Maigret asked. Carval hesitated, then shook his head. "Number Y hear nothing." His eyes flicked toward the attic window, then back to Maigret. "It's an old house. Old houses creak. People imagine things." "Perhaps," Maigret said. Carval gave a curt nod as if closing the conversation and walked away, his boots striking the cobbles hard. Maigret stayed a while longer, watching the house. Behind the lace curtain of an upstairs window, he thought he saw the faintest movement, a figure stepping back into shadow. That afternoon, Maigret visited the small bookshop near the square. He wasn't looking for books. The owner, Madame Joubert, had lived in Belremont her entire life and knew more about its people than anyone. She was rearranging a shelf of old novels when he entered. "Inspector?" she said, smiling faintly. "Looking for a story?" "Always," he said. He picked up a worn volume but didn't open it. "You've known the Carvals a long time." Her hands paused on the books. "Yes, since before Claire was born." "They seem troubled?" Madame Joubert hesitated. then sighed. "That house has never been happy." Even when the children were little, you could feel it. Madame Carval used to come in here, always with her eyes red, always pretending she'd just had a cold. And her son, he left as soon as he could, said he was going to Paris, but I think he was just running from something. Do you know what? She shook her head. People don't tell the whole truth, but they let pieces slip if you watch long enough. Maraud left with no new facts, but the shape of the family's shadows was becoming clearer. There was pain in that house, coiled tight, and it had been there for years. Whatever the attic held, real or imagined, it was only pressing on what was already fragile. That evening, Maraud walked by the canal again. The light was fading, and a chill wind stirred the surface of the water. Across the way, the Carval house glowed faintly from the downstairs windows. He paused on the bridge, listening. The town was quiet now, with only the distant clatter of a cartwheel somewhere far off. And in that stillness, he felt it again. That weight, that sense of a secret pressing against its own walls, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. He thought of Claire's trembling hands, of Madame Carval's pale face, of Monsieur Carval's hard, empty denial, and he knew the conversations were only just beginning. The truth, when it came, would not be loud. It would arrive in whispers, in pauses, in the space between words. The following days passed under a veil of muted stillness. Belremont carried on as it always did. Carts rattled along the cobbled streets, smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, and the church bell marked the hours with its patient toll. But for Inspector Lucien Maraud, the town felt quieter in ways that had nothing to do with sound. It was the kind of quiet that lived behind curtains, in half-closed doors, in the glances people shared and quickly looked away from. He found himself walking the canal path more than usual, letting the slow ripple of the water guide his thoughts. It was a path he had taken for years, yet lately it seemed to pull him toward one house in particular, the Carval house, with its brooding attic and windows that never quite reflected the light. On this particular afternoon, the sun was struggling through a bank of clouds, smearing a weak glow over the water. Maraud stopped near the small footbridge, resting his hand on the damp railing. The house loomed on the opposite bank, grey stone darkened from the recent rain. Even from a distance, he could feel the weight of it, as though the building itself carried a burden no one wanted to name. He didn't need to knock. He knew Madame Carval would appear if he waited long enough. And she did, hesitant, as if she had been standing in the hallway all along, listening for footsteps outside. "Inspector," she said, her voice just above a whisper. Her face was pale, her hair loosely pinned, a few strands trailing along her cheek. "I was walking by," Maraud said evenly. "I thought I might check on you." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The interior of the house was dim, as if daylight had been turned down to a cautious glow. Heavy curtains were drawn halfway, and the scent of furniture polish and damp stone lingered in the hall. Claire was in the parlour, curled in an armchair near the cold fireplace, her knees drawn up slightly. A book rested in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She gave Maraud a small, acknowledging nod before lowering her eyes again. For a few moments, no one spoke. Maraud let the silence stretch, letting the house speak instead. He noticed the small details, the ticking of a clock that seemed louder than it should, the faint stain along the ceiling where water had once leaked, the way Claire's hand absently brushed the armrest in a rhythm that suggested nerves rather than comfort. Finally, Madame Carval said, "It was worse last night." Maraud turned his head toward her, inviting more without words. "The whispering," she explained, her fingers knotting together. "Or whatever it is, I thought I heard footsteps, but soft, like someone trying not to be heard. Claire said she heard it too. It's as if—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "As if what?" Maraud prompted gently. "As if he came back." The room seemed to hold its breath. Maraud didn't ask the obvious question. He simply let the statement settle, and eventually the silence pulled more from her. "My son," she said finally. Her voice trembled on the word. "You've probably heard the talk. He left years ago. People said he had trouble. He wasn't a bad boy, just restless. He never said goodbye properly. I thought he might write, but he didn't." Claire's hand stilled on the armrest. Her eyes flicked toward her mother, then toward Maraud, as if weighing whether to speak. She didn't. "It's strange," Madame Carval continued, "how a house remembers the people who leave it. I walk into his old room sometimes, and I almost expect to hear his voice. Now with the noises—" Her lips tightened. "I feel him here again, or maybe I just want to." Maraud listened, his expression unreadable. He had seen this kind of quiet haunting before, the way absence could become louder than presence, the way guilt could echo in the smallest sounds. That evening, Maraud left the house and walked back through town. He passed the bakery, the bookshop, the square where the fountain no longer ran in winter. People greeted him with polite nods, but their eyes carried curiosity. He could feel the unspoken question in the air. Why does the inspector keep visiting the Carvals? He paused outside the church, leaning briefly against the low stone wall. From here he could see the town as a cluster of rooftops fading into the mist, with the Carval house standing apart, as if exiled by its own history. He thought about the sun, about the way Madame Carval's voice had softened when she spoke of him, carrying more longing than fear, about Claire's silence, her avoidance of her mother's eyes, about Monsieur Carval, who denied everything with a stiffness that seemed almost rehearsed. The family was haunted, but not by anything supernatural. Maraud didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in the persistence of memory and the way shame could outlive the people who caused it. 2 days later, a small moment stirred the town. Maraud was walking past the square when he saw Claire standing in front of the bookshop, her arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the mild weather. She was staring at the window display without really seeing it. When she noticed Maraud, she gave a faint smile, almost apologetic. "Are you taking a walk?" he asked. She nodded. "I couldn't stay in the house." Her voice was quiet, almost hoarse. "Too much noise?" She hesitated. "Too much memory." They walked together a short distance along the canal. The town sounds faded behind them, leaving only the shuffle of their footsteps. "I keep thinking about him," she said at last. "My brother. It's as if he's close somehow, not like a ghost, more like we never stopped expecting him to come back." "And do you want him to?" Maraud asked. She stopped walking, staring at the water. "I don't know," she whispered. When he left, everything felt lighter. But now it feels like he never really left at all. Like he's in the walls, in the floorboards. Maraud didn't reply. He simply watched the water with her, letting the moment rest in its own quiet tension. In that stillness, the emotional ghost of the missing son felt more tangible than any shadow in the attic. But that night, Maraud walked the streets again. Lights glowed faintly behind lace curtains. Dogs barked in distant gardens. The Carval house loomed as always, windows dark except for a single lamp in the downstairs hall. For a moment he thought he saw a figure in the attic window, a fleeting impression gone as soon as he noticed it. Perhaps it was nothing more than reflection, or perhaps his own mind had absorbed too much of the family's unease. He stood there a long time, the damp air clinging to his coat, until a church bell marked the late hour. Slowly, he turned back toward his own small apartment, carrying with him the weight of a house full of ghosts that weren't ghosts at all. The following morning arrived with a dim, colourless light, as if the sky itself had grown weary of Belremont's muted sorrow. Inspector Lucien Maraude rose early, his small apartment filled with the smell of coffee and damp wool from the coat hanging by the door. He lingered by the window, watching the thin mist rise from the canal, and for a long moment he did nothing at all, just listened. The town's sounds drifted faintly, the scrape of a broom on stone, a horse's hooves echoing from the square, a distant door shutting. Ordinary sounds, yet he had learned that in quiet towns, ordinary sounds often hid what people would not say. By late morning, he found himself at the Carval house again. He had not announced his visit, and he sensed they had stopped expecting him to. A certain inevitability seemed to draw him there, as if the house itself was asking him to keep watch. He stood before the door for several seconds before knocking. When it opened, it was Monsieur Carval who appeared, a rarity. The man's presence filled the doorway in a way that seemed almost defensive. His frame was heavy, his posture stiff. He was freshly shaved, but there was a dullness in his eyes that spoke of a poor night's sleep. "Inspector." His tone carried polite resistance, like a man answering a question he did not want to hear. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Maraude said evenly. Monsieur Carval hesitated, then stepped aside. "We were having tea." The hallway was colder than usual, though the day itself was not particularly chill. Maraude noticed the faint scent of polish and coal, and the sound of the clock in the parlour counting out seconds with merciless regularity. In the parlour, Madame Carval sat with her hands wrapped around a teacup, her knuckles white against the porcelain. Claire was at the window, gazing out toward the canal, as if the water might carry away the heaviness in the air. Neither of them rose. Maraude offered a small nod in greeting. No one spoke for several moments. Finally, Monsieur Carval said, "We appreciate your concern, Inspector. But I must insist, whatever noises my wife and daughter believe they've heard, it is nothing. Houses make sounds in the wind. Wood expands, pipes settle, that is all." His words were firm, but Maraude noticed his hands. One rested against the doorframe, fingers pressing lightly, then tightening as if grasping something unseen. It was the gesture of a man holding something in, anger, fear, or both. "I understand," Maraude replied softly. He took a seat across from Madame Carval, his manner unhurried, like a man with nowhere better to be. "May I ask, have you gone into the attic recently?" Monsieur Carval's gaze flickered, then hardened. "Number, and there's no reason to." "Perhaps," Maraude said mildly, "it would ease your wife's mind." "She does not need her mind eased," he said quickly, his voice a fraction louder. "She needs rest." At that, Madame Carval flinched, almost imperceptibly. Her eyes dropped to her tea. Claire shifted her weight near the window, but she said nothing. The silence that followed was long and brittle. Later, Maraude excused himself with the usual polite farewell. He stepped outside into the thin midday light and walked along the side of the house toward the canal path. As he passed under the eaves, he glanced upward. The attic window was closed tightly, the glass dark, reflecting the pale sky. But he noticed something small, something that would have escaped most eyes. A line of dust disturbed on the sill, as though the window had been touched recently from the inside. He did not linger. He walked the path along the canal, listening to the muted chatter of ducks and the occasional distant voice from town. The Carval house loomed behind him, heavy with its unspoken things. That afternoon, Maraud visited the bakery in the square. It was a place where the town's soft gossip tended to gather alongside the smell of bread. Madame Fournier, the baker's wife, was wiping the counter when she saw him enter. Her eyes lit with the small thrill of potential conversation. "Inspector," she said warmly. "You're out early?" Maraud nodded. "The air's fresher by the canal today. I passed by the Carval house again." Her face changed only slightly, but it was enough. A small flicker of curiosity, of recognition. "Ah, yes, that house. I've always said it's too big for 3 people, or 2, if you count the way Monsieur Carval keeps to himself." "Have they had many visitors lately?" "Not that I've seen," she said, lowering her voice a little. "Though I did see a light in the attic 2 nights ago." Strange, I thought. I hadn't seen that window lit in years. Maraud did not react. He thanked her for the loaf she wrapped for him and left the bakery with the weight of her words quietly settling into place. By evening, he returned to his own rooms. He sat at his small desk, opened a blank notebook, and stared at it without writing a single word. In his mind, he traced the silences of the Carval house, a door that is never opened, a father quick to deny, quick to grow rigid, a mother who listens for ghosts in the night, a daughter who carries the tension like a shadow across her face. Maraud was not chasing evidence. He was tracing emotional lines, the kind that wrapped around the house like a tightening cord. But the next day, he made one more visit, unannounced as always. When he arrived, he heard voices inside, low, tense. He hesitated, then knocked. Madame Carval opened the door, her face flustered, as if she had been caught mid-argument. Behind her, the hallway seemed darker than usual, and Maraud noticed that the door to the attic stairwell was ajar. "Inspector," she said softly. I wasn't expecting you." "I was nearby," he said. His eyes drifted to the stairwell. "Is that usually kept open?" She hesitated. "Number my husband. He prefers it shut." As she spoke, the door creaked softly, shifting as if caught by a faint draught. Maraud saw the dim line of steps leading upward into the attic's darkness. "I should close it," she said quickly, moving toward it. But before she did, a single sound floated down, soft, barely there. Not a whisper, not a clear word, just the faint impression of movement above, like a foot against wood, or the brushing of cloth along the floor. Madame Carval froze. Maraud did not move. Then Monsieur Carval appeared from the parlour, his face flushed. He strode to the stairwell, pushed the door firmly shut, and turned the key in the lock. "That door stays closed," he said. His voice left no room for argument. Maraud watched him, his expression neutral. But in that single moment, the quickness of the movement, the way Monsieur Carval avoided looking at either his wife or daughter, he felt the confirmation of everything he had suspected. The house was not haunted, but it was hiding something. And for now, the closed door would remain closed. But that night, Maraud walked the canal again, the echo of that quiet footstep lingering in his thoughts. The truth was pressing against the walls of the Carval house, waiting for the right silence to slip through. The morning came with a dim, washed-out light that seemed to flatten the streets of Belremont. Inspector Lucien Maraud sat by his small apartment window, sipping black coffee that had long turned lukewarm, watching a veil of mist drift lazily across the canal. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the distant scrape of a broom, the soft echo of hooves from the square, and the occasional clap of a door shutting somewhere unseen. It was an ordinary morning, yet the kind of morning that carried the weight of things unsaid. By late morning, Maigret found himself walking the familiar road to the Carvel house. He had not promised to return, yet some part of him had known he would. There was a heaviness about that place, a sense that it was drawing him back. He stopped at the door, hesitating a moment before knocking. The door opened to reveal Monsieur Carval, a rare sight in itself. He filled the doorway with his broad, rigid frame, freshly shaved, but with an air of weariness that clung to him like dust. "Inspector," he said, the word tight, polite, but guarded. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Maigret said, keeping his voice calm. Monsieur Carval hesitated, then moved aside. We were having tea. The hallway was dimmer than he remembered, the air smelling faintly of coal and furniture polish. The sharp ticking of a clock in the parlour cut through the silence like a metronome. When Maigret entered, he found Madame Carval with a teacup clutched in both hands, her fingers pale against the porcelain. Claire stood by the window, her face turned toward the canal, as though the water might hold some comfort. Neither woman rose. "We appreciate your concern, Inspector," Monsieur Carval said finally, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "But I must insist. Whatever noises they think they've heard, it is nothing. Houses shift, wood creaks, pipes settle, that is all." His words were measured, yet Maigret saw the tension in his hands. One rested on the doorframe, fingers curling and uncurling, a quiet betrayal of the calm he tried to project. "I understand," Maigret replied gently, taking a seat without waiting to be invited. "But I wonder, has anyone gone into the attic recently?" Monsieur Carval's gaze flickered before hardening. "Number, and there is no reason to." "Perhaps it would ease your wife's mind," Maigret said softly. "She does not need her mind eased," he said sharply, his voice rising a notch. "She needs rest." Madame Carval flinched almost imperceptibly, her eyes lowering to the tea in her hands. Claire shifted slightly at the window, her reflection pale against the glass. A silence settled in the room, brittle and suffocating. When Maigret finally rose to leave, he walked the length of the house slowly, letting his eyes drift upward as he stepped into the cool midday air. From the canal path he glanced up at the attic window. It was tightly shut, the glass reflecting only the blank sky. But the sill bore a thin smudge where dust had been disturbed, a faint mark that spoke of a hand or object brushing past not long ago. He walked along the canal, letting the soft noises of the town reach him, the clink of dishes from a kitchen, the flap of a bird's wings near the water. The Carval house loomed behind him, heavy and silent, its shutters like closed eyes. Later he stopped at the bakery on the square. Madame Fournier greeted him with a knowing smile, the sort of smile that often came before a whisper. "Inspector," she said warmly, "out early today." "The air by the canal is fresh," he said. "I passed the Carval house again." Her eyes lit with a trace of curiosity she couldn't quite suppress. "Ah, that house, always too big for 3 people. Or 2, if you count how little we see Monsieur Carval." "Have they had many visitors?" "Not that I've seen," she said, lowering her voice, "though I noticed a light in the attic 2 nights ago. Strange, I hadn't seen that window lit in years." Maigret said nothing. He simply accepted the loaf she wrapped for him, and when he left, her words trailed after him like a faint echo. That evening, back in his small apartment, he sat at his desk with a blank notebook. He didn't write. He only traced the pattern in his mind, the silences of that house, the gestures that spoke louder than the words. A door that was never opened, a father too quick to deny, too stiff to relax. A mother who listened for footsteps in the dark. A daughter carrying the quiet tension like a second skin. The next day he returned again, this time without knocking immediately. From the walkway he heard low voices inside, sharp in their urgency. He waited, then rapped softly. The door opened to Madame Carvel, her face flushed with the remnants of an argument. Behind her the hallway was shadowed, and Maraud's eyes caught on something new. The door to the attic stairwell stood slightly ajar. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft and uncertain. "I wasn't expecting you." "I was nearby," he said calmly. His gaze drifted toward the stairwell. "That door, is it usually open?" She hesitated. My husband, he prefers it shut." As she spoke, the door creaked faintly, a sound so delicate it might have been the house breathing. From above, something followed, a whisper of movement, soft and uncertain, like a foot brushing against wood or the drag of fabric across the floor. Madame Carval froze. Maraud stood still, his expression unreadable. Then heavy footsteps approached, and Monsieur Carval appeared from the parlour, his face red and set. Without a word, he strode to the stairwell, slammed the door, and turned the key in the lock. "That door stays closed," he said, his voice final. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at his daughter. He only met Maraud's gaze for a brief, stubborn moment before turning away. Maraud left soon after, saying nothing of what he had heard. He walked along the canal as the evening light began to fade. The image of that locked door pressed into his mind. He could still hear the faint sound from above, as if the house itself had exhaled a secret it could no longer keep. That night, the inspector sat by his window again, watching the still water. The Carval house was out there, dark and silent, with its attic sealed tight. He thought of the dust on the window, the whisper of movement, the nervous hands and quick denials. The house was not haunted, he knew. It was merely holding something in, and the silence around it was becoming heavier with every passing day. The days that followed felt slower, as though Belromont itself had taken a long, uneasy breath it could not release. The canal reflected the pale sky, undisturbed except for the occasional ripple from a drifting leaf. Life went on as it always had, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, children running down cobbled streets. But there was an undercurrent that Maraud could sense, a quiet hum of tension that did not belong to the ordinary rhythm of the town. He spent the mornings walking, letting his feet carry him without aim, his eyes absorbing the smallest changes, a shutter closed where it had been open yesterday, a curtain drawn more tightly than usual. He returned to the Carval house one afternoon, this time approaching from the side street that bordered the garden. The iron gate was slightly ajar. The path leading to the rear of the house was overgrown in patches, a sign of neglect that contrasted with the carefully swept front walk. He paused, listening. The house was still. Stillness in Belromont had begun to feel like a sound in itself. When he finally knocked on the front door, it was Claire who answered. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and there was a flush on her cheeks that spoke of either embarrassment or anger. She hesitated before opening the door wider, glancing over her shoulder as if to check who might be watching. "Inspector?" she said softly, her voice caught between relief and caution. "Your father at home?" he asked. She nodded but didn't call for him. Instead, she stepped aside, letting Maraud enter into the dim corridor. The air smelled faintly of old wood and something acrid, perhaps from the coal stove in the kitchen. The ticking of the parlour clock reached his ears like a distant heartbeat. Claire led him toward the back, where the kitchen looked onto the canal. Madame Carval sat at the table, sewing with deliberate slowness, her eyes lowered to the needle as if she feared meeting anyone else's gaze. "He's upstairs," Claire said in a low voice, her glance drifting toward the attic door. "He spends more time there now." "Does he?" Maigret said, his tone casual. Claire hesitated, her fingers toying with the edge of her sleeve. "I don't go up there. He says it's dangerous, the stairs, the floorboards. But I hear him walking, at night sometimes." Maigret watched her closely. Her words were plain enough, but the tightness in her mouth betrayed something unspoken. He had learned long ago that in houses heavy with secrets, the truth was often felt before it was spoken. Before he could respond, footsteps sounded above them, slow, deliberate steps crossing the attic floor. Madame Carval's needle stilled in mid-air. Claire's eyes flickered upward. Then, after a pause, the sound stopped. The kitchen seemed to grow smaller in that silence. "Have you spoken with your neighbours recently?" Maigret asked, breaking the tension with a gentle shift. "Some," Claire said. They wonder why we keep to ourselves. I think they hear things too, but no one asks us directly." It was true. In towns like Belremont, suspicion rarely travelled in a straight line. It curved through whispers, lingered in bakery queues, and settled like dust in the spaces between polite nods. Later that day, Maigret visited the small café by the square, where voices often loosened over warm coffee and the safety of familiar walls. Monsieur Lavigne, the owner, leaned against the counter as Maigret approached. "You've been looking thoughtful, Inspector," Lavigne said with a faint grin. "Have you heard anything about the Carval family?" Lavigne's grin faded into something measured. "Heard? Only the usual things, that the girl is pale as winter, that the wife looks like she listens to ghosts, and that the man of the house, well, some think he's hiding something." "Hiding what?" Maigret asked lightly. "That's the point," Lavigne said, lowering his voice. "No one knows. But when a man keeps a part of his house locked away and won't let even his family near it, people start to wonder." Maigret sipped his coffee slowly. He said nothing, but the cafe owner filled the silence himself, as most people did when they thought the inspector might be listening for more. "I'll tell you what I noticed," Lavigne continued. "2 nights ago I was walking back from the mill after dark. I passed the canal and saw a light in the attic. Not a candle, a lamp, bright for just a moment, then gone. And I swear I heard something, a sort of dragging sound like someone moving a trunk or chair across the floor." Maigret left the café with the information lodged quietly in his mind. The town was circling the Carvals with its murmurs. A suspect was emerging, though not with a single act or evidence. It was in the pauses, the sideways glances, the collective narrowing of the town's eyes. And, as was often the case, suspicion did not fall evenly. It was coiling itself around Monsieur Carval. That evening, Maigret took the long way back to his apartment, passing the Carval house once more. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney, and in one of the upper windows a shadow moved behind the curtains. He stood for a long moment by the canal, watching the reflection of the house tremble in the water. Inside that house, he imagined the tension pressing in like a weight, a wife who no longer asked questions aloud, a daughter who spoke softly, carrying worry in the slope of her shoulders, a man whose footsteps on the attic floor had become the rhythm of unease in the neighborhood. As he turned to leave, a figure emerged from the side of the house. It was Monsieur Carval himself, carrying a small wooden crate. He froze when he saw Maigret across the canal. For an instant, neither man moved. Then Carval gave the briefest nod and disappeared into the darkness toward the garden shed. Maraude walked away without calling out. He knew the town was ready to accuse, whether or not they had the truth. In Belremont, the presence of secrecy was often proof enough. He also knew that he could not yet move forward, not until the house itself yielded what it was holding. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Maraude listened to the muffled sounds of the town settling into sleep. Somewhere out there, the Carval house loomed, holding its silence. He could almost hear the whisper of steps across the attic boards, as if the house was breathing, waiting, and listening to itself. The morning mist clung to the canal like a soft curtain, blurring the edges of Belremont. Maraude walked along the water slowly, his coat buttoned against the faint chill. He had not slept much. Thoughts of the Carval house returned to him again and again, circling like a bird that would not land. He told himself he was only observing, only listening, but the truth was that the silence of that attic had begun to move inside his own mind. When he reached the square, the shops were just opening. A boy swept leaves from the bakery steps, his broom rasping against the stone. Madame Fournier arranged apples outside her store, glancing up only once to offer a polite smile. Life went on, but Maraude had learned to read the tremor beneath the routine. It was in the way conversation stopped when he approached, in the fleeting glances traded between neighbors, in the hollow quiet that followed him down the street. He decided to walk toward the Carval house, but without urgency. His pace was slow, as if letting the town reveal itself before he reached the heart of its unease. The garden still looked untended, the gate hanging slightly crooked. A pair of sparrows perched on the fence startled into flight when the gate creaked under his hand. He did not knock immediately, choosing instead to step to the side and look up toward the attic window. The curtain was drawn, but he thought he saw the faintest shift in the fabric, as if the room had eyes. When he finally knocked, the door opened only a fraction. Madame Carval stood there, her face tight, as though she had been expecting him and dreading it at the same time. "Inspector?" she said quietly. "I was passing by," he said. "Thought I'd ask how you're all managing." She hesitated before opening the door wider. The house smelled of bread and faintly of varnish, as though someone had recently tried to polish away time. In the parlor, a chair had been moved slightly, leaving a pale square on the carpet where it usually sat. Maraude noticed, but said nothing. Claire appeared from the back of the house, her steps soft, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. She greeted him with a small nod and lowered eyes. Maraude asked simple questions about the weather, about the canal, about nothing at all. The answers came softly, clipped and polite. He had learned that patience was his only tool here. When the silence stretched, Madame Carval excused herself to the kitchen. Through the doorway, Maraude could see her hands tremble as she reached for a pot. Claire lingered in the doorway, her fingers gripping the frame. "They're talking about us, aren't they?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Maraude met her eyes. "People always talk when they don't understand." She pressed her lips together, and for a moment he thought she might say more, but she only nodded, and he let the silence return. He had found that if he left room for words, they sometimes appeared on their own. Later that day, Maraude sat on a bench by the canal, watching the town move in its slow rhythm. A fisherman adjusted his net without hurry. A woman carrying laundry paused to exchange a few hushed words with another, their eyes flicking toward the Carval house. A group of children ran past, their laughter breaking the stillness for a moment before fading again. He thought about the house, about the footsteps in the attic, about the crate Monsieur Carval had carried into the garden shed. He thought about Claire's soft question, heavy with fear and shame. None of these things were evidence. They were fragments of a mood, threads in a web of quiet unease. But Maraud had learned that in towns like this, the weight of suspicion could crush more heavily than any proof. That evening, he took a walk along the path behind the Carval property. The sun was setting, staining the water orange and pink. He could see the attic window from this angle, just above the slant of the roof. The curtain moved again, so faintly he might have imagined it. He stood still, his hands in his pockets, listening to the distant croak of frogs. A soft sound reached him from the garden. He waited. After a moment, the shed door opened, and Monsieur Carval stepped out. He looked older than Moreau remembered, his shoulders rounded, his steps slow. He locked the shed carefully, glancing around as though the garden itself might be watching. Maraud did not speak. He let the man walk back toward the house, his figure fading into the dusk. There was something heavy in his movements, the weight of a man carrying not an object, but a thought he could not put down. The following morning, Maraud visited the café again. The air inside smelled of coffee and bread, comforting yet tinged with the sharpness of gossip. Levine leaned on the counter, wiping a cup with a cloth that had long since stopped drying anything. "You've been quiet these days," the café owner said. "Quiet is better than wrong," Maraud replied. Levine nodded, then lowered his voice. "People think Carval's hiding something in that attic. Some say they've seen him carrying boxes in and out at night. And the girl, she looks ready to break." Maraud stirred his coffee slowly. "Has anyone spoken to him?" Levine gave a short laugh. "No one dares. It's easier to talk than to knock on a man's door." The detective finished his coffee and left, walking toward the square again. The clouds had thickened, and a fine drizzle began to fall, dimpling the canal. He felt the weight of the town pressing against him, not physically, but in the way every glance seemed to ask him for answers he didn't yet have. That night, lying awake in his small apartment, Maraud listened to the rain on the roof and thought of the Carval house. He imagined the creak of the attic floorboards, the hush of voices that never carried through walls. He wondered what kind of secret could grow so heavy in such a quiet place. He wondered how long a family could carry it before something inside them broke. The town was watching, waiting, whispering. Maraud knew the first open accusation was only a matter of time, and still the attic waited. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the streets of Belremont slick and glistening, as though the town had been polished overnight. Maraud walked slowly along the canal, his shoes making soft, damp sounds against the cobblestones. He had no plan for the day beyond watching. Sometimes, he thought, the truth revealed itself not to those who hunted it, but to those patient enough to let it come to them. At the Carval house, the shutters were closed on the upper floor. A faint smell of damp wood and earth drifted from the garden, mixing with the scent of wet leaves. Maraud leaned against the low stone wall for a moment, pretending to admire the water beyond, but really he was listening. The house gave nothing away. Even the birds seemed reluctant to land in the garden. He continued to the bakery where Madame Fournier was arranging croissants in neat rows. She greeted him with her usual nod, but hesitated before speaking. "Have you heard?" she asked, her voice low. Maraud waited. "They say Monsieur Carval had a visitor last night. No one knows who. Someone saw a shadow at the gate after dark." "Who saw it?" The baker's eyes darted toward the back room. "My husband." He was closing up, Said the figure was small, maybe a woman. Maraude thanked her and bought a loaf he did not need. He walked the streets without hurry, thinking about the visitor, the closed shutters, the rain that had hidden footsteps. In the afternoon, he returned to the Carval house. Claire was in the garden, kneeling among weeds she did not seem to notice. Her dress was streaked with damp earth. She looked up when he approached, startled but not afraid. "You've been busy," Maraude said softly. "I needed to do something," she replied, her voice dull. She brushed her hands on her dress, leaving darker stains. He asked if her father was home. She nodded and led him to the parlour. The room smelled faintly of smoke and something sharper, like varnish or spirits. Monsieur Carval sat in the armchair, his posture rigid, his eyes on the empty fireplace. "Another rainy night," Maraude said. Carval blinked slowly. "Yes, the roof leaks a little in the attic. Did you have company?" The man's eyes flicked toward his daughter, then away. "No," he said, but the word came too quickly, too firmly. It left a trace of strain in the air. Maraude said nothing more, letting the silence sit between them like another person in the room. He had learned that people revealed themselves in the space between questions. Carval's fingers drummed once against the armrest, then stopped. Later that day, Maraude walked the narrow path behind the house again. The shed door was ajar. He hesitated, then stepped closer. Inside, the scent of damp wood was mixed with something metallic, almost sour. Boxes were stacked along one wall, some of them water-stained. One box was open, its lid leaning against the wall. Inside, he saw bundles of old letters tied with fraying string. He touched nothing. A sound behind him made him turn. Claire stood at the edge of the garden, her face pale. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "I was walking," he said calmly. "The door was open." She hugged her arms to her chest. "He keeps things. He doesn't like anyone touching them." "Letters?" Her mouth opened as if to answer, then closed again. Her gaze dropped to the wet ground. Maraude stepped back from the shed and let her close the door. That evening, he sat by his window and watched the lights across town flicker to life. He thought about the open box, the smell of metal, the sharpness in Carval's voice, the faint tremor in Claire's hands. The town's first secret had been the attic, the footsteps, the whispers. But this was something else, hidden in plain sight. The next morning, he visited Levine's cafe. The usual hum of quiet talk filled the air, but when Maraude entered, a pause rippled through the room. Levine poured him coffee and leaned close. "There's talk," he said. "Old talk about the Carvals and that house. People say Monsieur Carval's brother disappeared years ago, went to the city and never came back. Some say he wrote letters." Maraude stirred his coffee. "What kind of letters?" Levine shrugged. "Angry ones, maybe shameful. No one ever saw them. But there was a quarrel before he left. People remember things like that." The detective nodded. He could almost see the threads connecting now, the attic, the shed, the letters. A family shaped by silence and absence, by something that had festered for years until the town itself could smell it in the damp autumn air. That afternoon, Maraude returned once more to the canal path. He saw Monsieur Carval standing by the water, his back to the street, his hands gripping the railing. He looked like a man holding himself up against the weight of something heavy inside. Maraude approached without sound. "Beautiful evening," he said. Carval flinched, then nodded without turning. "The water's high," he murmured. They stood together for a long moment. The only sounds were the soft lapping of water and the distant creak of a cart in the square. "Secrets are like this river," Maraud said quietly. "They find a way out sooner or later." Carval's shoulders tensed, then slumped. He did not answer, and Maraud did not press him. He simply watched the current flow past, carrying away leaves and fragments of the day. As the sun dipped low, he returned to his apartment with a quiet certainty. The first secret had drawn the town's eyes upward to the whispering attic. But the second secret was heavier, older, and closer to breaking. It lived in the damp boxes of the shed, in the letters that no one read aloud, in the silence of a family that had been waiting for years for someone to ask the right question. And now, Maraud thought, the town would not have to wait much longer. The wind had turned cold overnight, pressing against the narrow streets and carrying the smell of wet stone and distant wood smoke. Maraud walked through the town just after dawn, his coat collar turned up, his steps slow and measured. Belremont was still waking, a few windows glowing faintly, a dog barking somewhere unseen. He had not slept much. Images of the shed, the letters, and Monsieur Carval's rigid figure at the canal drifted through his thoughts. The weight of what was unspoken seemed heavier now, pressing on the edges of every silence he entered. He stopped by the grocer's for an apple, exchanging a quiet nod with the owner. The man hesitated before speaking, his voice kept low as though the air itself might carry his words to the wrong ears. "They say Claire hasn't been to church since last Sunday," he said. "That's not like her." Maraud chewed the thought as he chewed the apple, walking slowly toward the Carval house. When he arrived, the garden looked unkempt, yesterday's leaves sticking to wet patches of soil. He saw Claire at the window, her face half hidden behind the curtain. She did not wave. He knocked softly at the door. After a pause long enough to suggest reluctance, she opened it. Her hair was unbrushed, and her cardigan slipped from one shoulder. "You're early," she said. "I like the morning," Maraud said. "It tells more truth than the evening." She let him in, stepping aside without meeting his eyes. Inside, the house smelled of cold coffee and the faint, sour trace of something that had been left too long on the counter. Monsieur Carval sat at the table, a cup untouched before him, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. He looked older than the week before, as if sleep had thinned him out from the inside. "You're out early," Maraud said gently. Carval's fingers twitched once against the cup. "Couldn't sleep." Maraud said nothing. He watched the room instead, the way Claire hovered by the doorway, the way Carval's shoulders sagged beneath an invisible weight. The silence stretched until Carval filled it with a single sentence. "It was my brother's handwriting on those letters." Claire's sharp inhale broke the stillness. Her hand gripped the doorframe as though she had been struck. Maraud did not move, his voice soft as falling dust. "You read them?" Carval shook his head. "Number I knew before I opened the box. I kept them. I don't know why. He wrote to me and I left them tied up. He begged once. Then he cursed me. And then he was gone." Claire crossed the room and sat down slowly, like her legs might fail her. Her eyes shone with something close to fear, though it was not fear of Maraud. "I never knew," she whispered. "You never said anything." Carval's gaze remained on the table. His lips trembled, not with anger, but with the fragile effort of holding himself together. "I told everyone he left for work," he said. "I told myself that too, but he didn't. He left because of me. I shut him out. I told him he was nothing. And then he disappeared." The clock ticked against the wall. Maraud could hear the faint creak of the house as it settled in the wind. He let the words sit where they fell, knowing that pressing for more would close the door again. After a long moment, Carval rose and walked toward the parlour, moving slowly, as though each step cost him a piece of himself. Claire followed, her hand reaching out, then stopping short of his shoulder. Moiraud stayed where he was, listening to the floorboards and the soft murmur of their voices. He stepped outside after some time and followed the narrow lane behind the house to the canal. The air smelled of rain and rotting leaves. He leaned on the railing, remembering the way Carval had gripped it 2 days before. Secrets had their own current, he thought. Left too long, they carved deep channels through the people who held them. By midday, the town was whispering. He heard fragments as he walked through the square. Someone had seen Monsieur Carval walking alone toward the edge of town. Someone else said Claire had been crying in the yard. The story changed with each voice, but the undercurrent was the same. Belremont could smell the fracture. Moiraud returned in the afternoon to find the front door open. Inside, Carval sat in the dim parlour, staring at the empty fireplace. He looked as though he had been sitting there for hours. "I don't know if I can carry it any more," he said, without turning his head. "You've carried it a long time," Moiraud said. Carval exhaled, a sound like the slow leak of air from a cracked pipe. His hands hung uselessly between his knees. "They all think I'm respectable," he said. "I go to the market, I speak politely, I nod in church. But I'm a coward. My brother begged for my help. He wanted to come home. I left his letters in that shed like they were nothing. And now he's just a shadow no one remembers." Claire appeared in the doorway, her face pale and wet. "Papa," she said softly, "please don't." But she didn't finish the sentence. Moiraud watched the way Carval's head tilted slightly toward the sound of her voice, as if her plea could anchor him, but he did not move. His eyes remained on the black mouth of the cold fireplace. Evening settled over the town, soft and grey. The lamplighter moved through the streets, leaving small halos in the fog. Moiraud left the house as quietly as he had entered it, his shoes crunching on the gravel path. He felt the weight of the day pressing against his chest, not with urgency, but with inevitability. The house behind him held its breath. Inside, a man sat with the crumbling walls of his own silence, the edges of shame closing in like nightfall. Moiraud knew that moral pressure did not shout or strike. It pressed inward, quietly, until the soul either confessed or broke apart under the strain. He walked back to his apartment, the canal whispering beside him, and thought of the letters waiting in the shed, bound with string, their words unread but louder now than they had ever been in life. The town would sleep tonight, but in the Carval house something had already begun to collapse. Rain arrived in the night, soft at first, then harder, drumming on the slate roofs and trickling along the narrow gutters of Belremont. By morning, the streets were slick and dark, the canal swollen with brown water that carried leaves and a few drifting twigs. Moiraud walked slowly, feeling the damp in his coat and shoes. He had risen early, as he always did, when the weight of other people's silence pressed too close to his own thoughts. The Carval house stood grey against the wet morning. Its shutters were closed, but one of the upstairs windows was slightly open, the curtain trembling in the wind. Moiraud lingered at the gate, hesitating to knock, listening to the faint creak of the house as it shifted in the damp. He thought of the last time he had left this street, the stillness in Monsieur Carval's eyes, the way Claire's voice had tried to pull him back from some quiet edge. When the door finally opened, Claire stood there. She had wrapped herself in a sweater, and her hair was damp, sticking to her forehead. Her voice was thin, as if it had been worn out overnight. "He hasn't come down," she said. Maraud stepped inside, the smell of wet wood and yesterday's cold ashes clinging to the rooms. The house was dim, as though the walls themselves refused the morning. They moved toward the stairs together, the boards groaning under their feet. Claire paused outside her father's door. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried to talk to him, but he just wouldn't answer." Maraud knocked gently. No response. He waited, the silence heavy, carrying that unmistakable sense of a room holding its own secret. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. Monsieur Carval sat in a chair by the window, his coat draped over his knees. His posture was slumped, his head tilted slightly forward, and his eyes were half closed as though sleep had stolen him upright. On the small table beside him lay an empty glass and a folded letter, the edges softened by handling. Maraud approached slowly, his own breath shallow in the close air. Carval stirred at the sound of the floorboard creak. His voice emerged hoarse, each word scraped raw. "I didn't sleep," he said. "I just sat here, thinking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing by the shed, holding the letters, waiting." Claire moved into the room, her hands clenched against her chest. "Papa, please." He raised a hand weakly, stopping her words. His eyes found Maraud's instead. "I kept it all locked away, all those years. I told myself it would fade. It doesn't. It grows like mold in the dark." Rain pattered against the window. The room smelled faintly of damp wool, and the metallic tang of the canal carried in on the wind. Maraud said nothing. He had learned that words at such a moment only pressed a man further into himself. Carval's breathing hitched, a single broken sound. He leaned forward, elbows on. His knees, head in his hands. His shoulders trembled, not with the sharpness of sobs, but with the heavy exhaustion of a man finally bending under the weight he could no longer lift. Claire approached, kneeling beside him, her hand hesitant on his sleeve. He did not flinch, but he did not look at her either. "I lied to everyone," he whispered. "I lied to myself. I said he left to make his life better, but I knew. I knew when the letters stopped. He was gone because of me." A clock somewhere in the house ticked faintly, marking each long second. The room felt suspended, as though the rain outside were the only thing keeping time moving at all. "I can't face them," Carval said. "The neighbors, the priest, even the boy at the grocer's. They all look at me and think I'm decent. I'm not." Claire clutched his arm, her face pale, lips trembling. "Papa, stop. It's not too late. Please just—" Her voice faltered, breaking under the weight of something she couldn't finish. Carval's gaze drifted to the folded letter. His fingers touched the edge of the paper, tracing it like the outline of a face. Then he let his hand fall. "I thought I was strong," he murmured, "but I was only proud, and pride leaves you alone in the end." Maraud stayed by the window, his hands in his pockets, his own reflection faint in the glass. He had seen this before, though each time it carried its own shape. Guilt was a slow poison. It hollowed people until they became their own empty house, walking and speaking, but already gone inside. The rain eased toward midday, and the house grew quieter, the kind of quiet that felt final. Carval barely moved. Claire fetched him tea, which cooled untouched on the table. She tried to start little conversations about nothing, the neighbor's garden, the river rising, but each attempt fell into the heavy stillness between them. By evening, the collapse had taken a different shape. Carval rose suddenly from his chair and went to the wardrobe. He pulled down a small suitcase, one that smelled faintly of mothballs and old travel. Claire's voice trembled. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer. He placed the suitcase on the bed, opening it with a sigh, and stared at the empty interior. His hands hovered over the space as though waiting for instructions that would never come. Then he closed it again, leaving it empty, and sat down on the bed, face in his hands. Maigret watched from the doorway. He knew this was not a man preparing to flee, but a man measuring the distance between what he was and what he had lost. The room, with its simple furniture and the faint smell of damp linen, held more weight than the suitcase ever could. As night settled over Belremont, Carval lay down without undressing. Claire sat by the bed, her eyes rimmed red, her body small in the chair beside him. Maigret left quietly, the door clicking behind him, his shoes carrying him back along the wet streets. He knew that this kind of collapse did not always come with shouting or with violence. Sometimes it was just a man lying in a bed he could no longer sleep in, staring at the ceiling, his soul quietly unraveling. The canal reflected the lamps in broken streaks of light as Maigret walked home. He thought of the town that would wake tomorrow with its familiar routines, unaware that in one quiet house a life had already folded in on itself, like a letter left unopened for too many years. The following morning the sun broke through a thin veil of mist, casting the canal and the crooked streets of Belremont in a muted gold. Life moved on as it always did. The baker opened his shutters, releasing the smell of fresh bread into the damp air. A fisherman adjusted his nets on the bank. Children ran past Maigret as he walked slowly toward the square, their laughter bright and careless. No one paused to notice the hollow silence that clung to the Carval house. Word had already spread through the town, but in the way such things spread here, quietly, like smoke seeping under a door. People knew Monsieur Carval was unwell, that something had happened, though no one used the word guilt or collapse. They preferred softer words, tired, worn, sick with worry. By the time Maigret reached the cafe, the story had already softened into something everyone could live with. The men by the window nodded to him. Their voices were low, but the rhythm of gossip was unmistakable. "Hard on a man, losing family like that," one said, shaking his head. "They say he sat up all night," another added, stirring his coffee, eyes flicking toward the Carval house across the square. "Saw him once at dawn, standing by the window, like a man keeping watch over his own sorrow." Maigret ordered a black coffee and listened. The town was doing what it always did with uncomfortable truths, sanding them down until they no longer cut the skin. By noon, Carval's long-buried guilt had become a story about poor health, the strain of age, perhaps a touch of melancholy, brought on by the endless rain. The postman entered the cafe, brushing water from his hat. He leaned on the counter and spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. "I brought a letter to the house yesterday. From some cousin in Lyon, I think. Maybe that's what upset him. Family things can stir old feelings." There it was, the version the town would accept, not guilt. Not the ghost of a son gone too long without a proper goodbye. Just the soft melancholy of old age and letters from far away. Everyone nodded. It was easier this way. Maud walked to the Carval house in the afternoon. The rain had returned, a fine mist that dampened his coat and hair. Claire opened the door with a weary smile that did not reach her eyes. Inside, the air smelled faintly of boiled potatoes and damp cloth. Carval lay in bed, propped up by pillows, his face grey and slack. He did not speak much, but his eyes found Maigret's. Briefly, and in them, Maigret saw that the story the town was telling did not touch the truth living inside this room. "He's resting," Claire said softly. The doctor came. He said it's just exhaustion. Maraud nodded. He could hear the careful construction in her voice, the way she held up the town's lie like a fragile lantern against the dark. She needed it. Without that version, the house would drown in shame. He sat for a while, listening to the faint ticking of the hall clock and the distant drizzle against the window. Carval dozed, or pretended to. Claire busied herself in the kitchen, wiping surfaces that were already clean, pausing often to glance toward the bedroom door. When Maraud left, the street was quiet. He saw two neighbors talking by the canal, their heads bent close. One woman gestured toward the Carval house with a little shrug, the universal gesture of pity. Not suspicion, not judgment, just the soft, polite acceptance of a story everyone had agreed upon. In the days that followed, the rhythm of Belremont returned. The fishmonger haggled on the quay, the school bell rang, the priest conducted his rounds. Only in the evenings when Maraud walked the damp streets did he notice the small signs of unease, a shutter closing quickly when he passed. A conversation cut short when the name Carval arose. Not malice, just the quiet recoil of people who preferred the version of events they could live with. One afternoon, Maraud visited the canal bridge. The water slid below, brown and slow, carrying the reflection of the crooked houses. He remembered Carval's trembling hands, his whisper of pride and shame, the empty suitcase on the bed. He wondered if anyone besides Claire would ever carry the weight of what had really happened. That evening at the cafe, the conversation drifted toward other things. A delivery boat delayed by rain. A stray dog spotted near the mill. The Carval story had already slipped to the edges, tucked into the safe drawer of memory where inconvenient truths were left to fade. Someone mentioned the priest had visited and said prayers. Another nodded, relieved. A prayer was tidy. A prayer meant closure. Maraud did not argue, did not speak. He sipped his coffee and let the lie settle into the room like the smell of damp wood. He understood this ritual of forgetting, this quiet survival of small towns where truth was often too sharp to touch. He had carried enough of other people's secrets to know that silence was sometimes its own form of mercy. When night fell, the rain stopped. The cobblestones glistened under the lanterns, and the Carval house sat still and dark, blending into the quiet street like it had always been part of the scenery. Maraud paused outside, looking at the closed shutters, the faint reflection of his own face in the wet window. He thought of the letter folded on the table, the one the town would never see. He thought of the man inside, heavy with a truth that would never leave these walls. The lie had been accepted. The town could sleep again. Only the detective carried the unspoken weight, and he carried it alone. On the wind off the canal was colder that morning, carrying the smell of damp wood and the faint tang of smoke from distant chimneys. Maraud walked slowly along the narrow street, his steps careful, as if the cobblestones themselves were listening. The town had settled into its chosen story. No one spoke of what had happened anymore, except in gentle, hushed tones that polished the memory smooth. To them, Monsieur Carval was simply an old man who had endured too much and finally crumbled under the weight of life. Nothing more needed to be said. Maraud passed the bakery, where the window fogged with the warmth of ovens and fresh bread. The baker's wife waved at him, her face bright but distant. She did not invite him in. He continued toward the square, where the fountain sputtered weakly. A woman knelt by the edge to rinse a basket of leeks, her hands red with cold. She glanced up at him, nodded, and looked away. That was the town now, polite glances, short nods, the soft rustle of avoidance. At the cafe, the usual men gathered by the window. smoke curled above their cups. When Maraud entered, the bell on the door rang sharply, drawing a brief silence. He felt their eyes on him, but no one spoke. Then the murmurs returned, voices folding over one another like dry leaves. He ordered a coffee and sat by the corner, letting the warmth of the cup seep into his hands. He thought about speaking. He thought about standing, clearing his throat, and telling them everything. The suitcase, the confession that wasn't a confession, the guilt that had seeped through that house like water through rotting wood. He imagined their faces, the ripple of discomfort, the way they would exchange looks and wait for him to finish so they could pretend they hadn't heard. The truth would not save anyone. It would only cut the surface of the quiet life they had chosen, leaving an open wound they would rush to bandage with new lies. Across the square he could see Claire opening the shutters of the Carval house. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She paused to look at the sky as though gauging the weather, but Maraud knew she was feeling the town's eyes on her. She had become part of the story now, a devoted daughter caring for a frail father. That was the role she had agreed to inhabit. If he spoke, he would tear that role away from her. He left the cafe before finishing his coffee, the bitter taste still on his tongue. The street smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet earth. He walked without thinking until he found himself by the canal, staring at the slow water. A boat slid past, its oars dipping silently. The reflection of the houses trembled, broken by the ripples. He remembered the first day he had arrived in Belremont for the case, the way the town seemed harmless and ordinary. That illusion had lasted only until he listened closely. He thought about the sun, always the sun, the absence heavier than any presence, the memory of a boy who had run from his father's shadow and from this town, leaving behind a wound that never closed. Maraud had pieced together enough fragments to understand the shape of what had happened, but the full story would remain unspoken. It lived in glances, in the tightening of Claire's jaw, in the trembling of Carval's hands, in the hushed lies exchanged over coffee. As the church bell marked the hour, Maraud felt the decision settle inside him like a stone sinking in deep water. He would not speak. He would carry the truth himself. It would become another quiet burden, like the others he had carried in other towns, in other lives. A detective's work was rarely about justice. It was about understanding, and sometimes that meant leaving the world untouched. That evening, he visited the Carval house one last time. Claire met him at the door, her face pale but composed. Carval lay in the same bed, his eyes half closed, drifting between sleep and wakefulness. He looked smaller, as though part of him had already withdrawn from the world. Maraud sat beside the bed, saying little. The lamplight threw soft shadows across the room, catching the hollow in Carval's cheeks. After a long silence, the old man spoke, his voice a whisper. "They believe me now?" Maraud hesitated before answering. "They believe what they need to." A faint, trembling smile appeared on Carval's lips. His eyes closed again, and Maraud felt the weight of the choice he had made. The truth would stay in this room. The town could go on breathing. When Maraud stepped outside, night had settled over Belremont. A few lamps flickered in the windows, and the air was damp with the scent of river water. He walked back toward the inn, feeling the quiet press around him like a heavy coat. He knew he would leave soon, and when he did, the town would return to its rhythms as if he had never been there. The lie would harden into memory, and memory would eventually become fact. He paused once more on the bridge, leaning on the wet railing. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The moon slipped from behind a cloud, lighting the canal in a thin, silver line. Maraud watched the water flow and thought of the truths he carried, sinking into him like stones. Some would never see the light again, and that perhaps was the only mercy he could offer. The days after the decision passed without remark, like leaves drifting down a slow river. Belromont returned to its gentle rhythm, its people adjusting their lives around the soft fiction they had agreed to tell. The market square bustled again with its familiar routine, the butcher calling out prices, the fishmonger arranging his catch on a bed of melting ice, the clink of coins and the hum of brief conversations about weather and recipes. It was as though nothing had happened, as though no whisper of guilt had ever moved through the town's narrow streets. Maraud noticed how quickly the air of normality settled. He watched neighbors greet each other with nods and polite laughter, their voices smooth, carefully avoiding the name Carval unless absolutely necessary. When it was spoken, it came wrapped in gentleness. Poor man, fragile these days. Thank goodness Claire is there. The words were soft as cotton, harmless, reassuring. No one wanted to remember the tension that had gripped the town only weeks before. It was easier to speak as though the story had always been this simple. The detective spent his mornings walking the canals, boots tapping softly against the slick cobblestones. Mist rose from the water, blurring the reflections of the crooked houses and the arched bridges. He passed the same fishermen, the same laundry strung between narrow alleys, the same cats slinking along the walls. Belromont seemed unchanged, but Maraud carried a weight that left him slightly apart from it all. He had become a silent keeper of something the town had chosen to bury. At the café, the men by the window had returned to their old subjects, boat schedules, the priest's sermons, the stubborn cold that would not lift. They greeted him with brief nods, offered him coffee, and spoke with the easy cadence of people who had already smoothed over a jagged memory. Maraud listened and watched, feeling the familiar dissonance settle inside him. He had left the truth untouched, and in doing so he had allowed the town to keep its peace. But the knowledge of what had truly unfolded remained like a thin thread stretched tight within him. One afternoon he saw Claire in the square carrying a basket of bread and potatoes. She moved quietly, her posture straight but careful, as though she were balancing a glass of water she could not spill. Their eyes met, and she gave him the faintest nod of acknowledgement. Her face revealed nothing, but the slightest flicker passed between them, a recognition that they shared a secret that could not be spoken. She passed by, blending into the crowd, another ordinary figure in the market. The Carval house itself had changed in subtle ways. The shutters were opened more often now, and the faint smell of stew drifted through the street at meal times. Maraud passed by sometimes at dusk and saw the glow of a single lamp in the front room, Claire's shadow moving back and forth. Monsieur Carval rarely appeared. The town seemed content to imagine him resting, recovering, perhaps mending, in the way that time and distance allow. Maraud knew better. Some things did not mend, they only became quieter. Rain fell for 2 days without pause, turning the streets slick and dark, the water in the canal swelling against the stone edges. Maraud spent much of that time in his rented room at the inn, listening to the muffled sounds of life below, cutlery, murmured conversation, the occasional clatter of a door. He wrote nothing in his notebook. There was nothing to record that would ever leave this place. Cases like this one were not for reports or files. They belonged to the air of the town itself, absorbed into the damp walls and the whispered habits of its people. On the 3rd day, the rain cleared, and a pale sun broke through the clouds. The square filled again with life. Children ran across the wet stones, leaving footprints that quickly faded. A farmer sold cabbages from the back of his cart, and a pair of old women carried baskets of eggs, gossiping softly. Maraud walked among them and felt the strange comfort of ordinary life returning. It was as though the town had inhaled, held its breath, and now released it in one long, collective sigh. He returned to the canal bridge at sunset, leaning on the damp railing. The water was calm, carrying the reflection of the orange sky and the black silhouettes of the chimneys. A dog barked in the distance, and somewhere a door closed with a hollow sound. The world felt almost gentle. He thought of the many places he had been, the many rooms where the air had been heavy with secrets no one dared to speak aloud. He thought of the lives rearranged by small, quiet tragedies, and of the lies towns told themselves to keep moving forward. Belremont was healing itself in its own way, not through justice or confrontation, but through the soft erasure of memory, the quiet decision to fold the truth into a version that could be lived with. Maraud found no anger in himself about it. There was a kind of inevitability to it, as certain as the slow current of the canal. People could not live forever in the rawness of truth. Sooner or later they smoothed it down until it fit in the palm of the hand. That evening, the detective sat in the cafe and listened to the piano in the back room, its notes drifting softly over the low murmur of conversation. He felt almost invisible there, a man passing through a town that had chosen to forget. He did not mind. His work had always been about seeing what others preferred not to see, and then stepping quietly aside when the world returned to its preferred shape. When he left the cafe, the streets were lit by the warm glow of lamps, and the canal shimmered under the moonlight. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, taking in the smell of wet stone and smoke. Belremont was at peace again, or close enough to it. The truth remained in his mind, a steady presence, but it no longer pressed against him with urgency. He had become part of the silence now, another witness who would leave without leaving a trace. So years passed, and Belremont seemed unchanged to anyone who did not know how to look. The canal still cut its slow line through the town, carrying reflections of the crooked houses and the narrow bridges. Market days were still filled with the familiar calls of vendors and the soft shuffle of feet on cobblestone. Children grew into young adults and left, some returning, most not. The town had learned to keep its rhythm steady, as if nothing had ever threatened it. Maraud returned one autumn evening, older now, his hair gone to grey, his posture slightly more stooped. He had not thought of Belremont in years, but a case in a neighbouring district had brought him near, and something quiet in him wanted to see the town again. He walked along the canal as the sun sank, the air carrying that mix of wood smoke and damp stone he remembered. It was as if the town had been waiting for him, though it had no memory of his face. The inn had changed hands. A young couple ran it now, their laughter echoing in the hallway as they argued softly about bread for the morning. Maraud took a room overlooking the square, the same square he had walked across years ago when the story of Carval and Claire hung in the air like a shadow no one wanted to name. He leaned against the window frame and watched the square empty at nightfall. There were new lamps now, electric and brighter, but they could not soften the memories that returned to him like a slow tide. The next morning he wandered past the old Carval house. The shutters were closed, paint peeling, ivy climbing high up the side. He stood for a while, hands in his pockets, listening. No sound came from inside. A neighbour, an old woman bent nearly double, came out to sweep her step. She looked at him without recognition. He nodded and, after a pause, asked about the house. Vacant for 2 years, she said. Claire had left after her husband died, quietly, like a shadow. No funeral anyone remembers, just a paper on the church board. Someone said she went to live with a cousin in the south. The old woman shrugged, her broom tapping lightly against the stones. Houses like that keep the cold, she added, and went back to sweeping. Later, at the cafe, Maigret sat at a corner table, listening to the conversations around him. The voices were different now, younger, livelier. The men by the window were gone. The piano in the back room was silent, covered with a thin cloth. Time had moved forward, but the undercurrent of the town felt the same, soft, cautious, unwilling to linger too long on old things. In the afternoon, he walked out to the far edge of the town where the fields opened to low hills. The wind carried the smell of damp leaves and earth. He stopped beneath a row of bare poplars and leaned against the trunk of one, his coat collar turned up against the chill. It was there, alone with the wind and the distant roofs of Belremont, that he allowed the truth to rise again, as quietly as it had settled in him years before. He thought of Claire's eyes the night she had finally let the truth slip without ever putting it into words. The way her hands had rested on the back of the chair, unmoving, her voice steady but fragile. He had understood without her saying it outright. Carval's shame, his growing silence, his sudden fall into despair, it had all tied back to the thing they both carried in their hearts. A betrayal that was not criminal in the eyes of the law, but had burned him alive from the inside. Maigret had never told anyone. He had let the town's softer version of the story take root because he knew it would keep Belremont whole. And now, standing in the wind, he realized the truth was almost like a private possession, a relic of his own life rather than a piece of evidence. He whispered it aloud just once, a single sentence carried off by the air, knowing that no one else would ever hear it. On his last evening in Belremont, he returned to the canal bridge. The water was black and smooth, reflecting the lamps in broken streaks. A young couple passed by, laughing softly, the girl's hand resting in the crook of the boy's arm. Their voices faded into the night. Maigret rested his elbows on the cold stone and let the quiet surround him. He thought of all the towns he had visited, all the quiet tragedies that had passed like invisible storms, leaving behind people who learned to smile again in the market or at the cafe. He stayed there for a long time until the air grew sharper and the square emptied completely. The old truth lived in him still, unspoken, unrecorded, like a faint scent that never truly leaves a room. He knew that when he left in the morning, Belremont would fold him back into its history as if he had never been there. The town would continue with its soft, unbroken rhythm, and the story of the whispering attic would remain only as a shadow in the memory of one man leaning on a bridge at night, watching the water carry away the last trace of light.